Oh, fuck.
Yo, my forehead is so big and I've got all these baby hairs and I am not beating the balding allegations. Unfortunately, I ain't. Okay. We're giving this a third crack, okay? I honestly don't know how to go about this topic because it is such an incendiary topic at the moment. I think it's highly triggering, especially for a lot of women at the moment. So I should preface this with a trigger warning. I will be talking about gender-based violence as well as rape culture in this episode, and if me talking about these topics brings up any heavy feelings and emotions for you, I really encourage you to contact 1-800-RESPECT, which is a 24/7 hotline. You can also contact WIRE, which is 1300 134 130. In Australia, we are facing an epidemic of gender-based violence, and my heart breaks for 34 women have been murdered at the hands of men. I think there's a very somber feeling collectively. There's a feeling of helplessness. And unfortunately, it's like a very multifaceted issue. I wish the solution... Motherfucker. Oi, your dog. I wish the solution was as simple as just educating young men on consent and how to treat women like human fucking beings and not objects to be rated and objectified. I wish the solution to gender-based violence was something as simple as men just calling out their mates more whenever they make sexist fucking jokes or comments or engage in like heinous locker room banter. I wish the solution to misogyny was this simple, but unfortunately I just don't think it is, because at the end of the day, we have so many structural forces at play. Misogyny is an economic problem, okay? It's a judicial problem. I think the justice system has failed women time and time again, as there's countless stories of women getting AVO orders against men only for them to be murdered by that same man, often in her own house. It's a social problem. There is a crisis amongst young men who are feeling extremely lonely and are experiencing mental health issues, and unfortunately due to patriarchal and outdated ideas around masculinity, they don't feel as though they can reach out to help. You know, men have high and rising rates of mental health problems, including loneliness, depression, and suicide. It's an intersectional problem as well. Indigenous women are 10 times more likely to experience gender-based violence than non-Indigenous women. And First Nations people are, I think, 7 times more likely to be victims of homicide than non-Indigenous people. I also think that it is a literacy problem as well as a technological problem. And those two are kind of going to be the latter factors that I'm going to be focusing on today and talking about today. So today, what I want to talk about is the manosphere and technology's role in enabling the proliferation of misogyny and male supremacist ideology that is resulting in real-world violence and, in some cases, acts of terrorism, as we've seen recently in Bondi Junction. So you may be wondering, what is the manosphere? Well, the manosphere is a collection of online spaces, communities, and influences that generally promote traditional and outdated gender roles and masculinity, as well as there's a general opposition towards feminism. So even though there might be some conflicting beliefs within the manosphere, generally, on the whole, they are all united in the belief that society is biased against men due to the influence of feminism, and that feminists promote misandry or hatred against men, and as a result of that, they feel sometimes oppressed. There's a wide range of communities within the manosphere, ranging from, on one end of the spectrum, pickup artists, which I think have now kind of rebranded into a new flavor of hustle bros, i.e. guys trying to sell impressionable young and vulnerable men an online course. I'm looking at you, Andrew Tate. Then you've got fathers' rights groups, men's rights activists, and then you've got men going their own way, which is a community where men are forsaking all contact with women altogether. And then on the other end of the spectrum, In the far more extreme end of the spectrum, you've got involuntary celibates, otherwise known as incels. The manosphere overlaps a lot with the far right and alt-right communities. It has been associated with online harassment and has been implicated in radicalising men into misogynist beliefs and the glorification of violence against women. Some sources have associated manosphere-based radicalization with mass shootings motivated by misogyny and incel ideology. The manosphere received significant media coverage following the 2014 Isla Vista shootings in California, the 2015 Umpqua Community College shooting in Oregon, as well as the 2018 Toronto van attack and the online harassment campaign against women in the video game industry known as Gamergate. So you may be wondering, what the fuck is an incel? Great question. An incel is an involuntary celibate. It's a man, usually a young man, whose identity is defined by his lack of experience with women. He blames women and society for this. And a lot of incels tend to communicate in the form of memes. There's the Virgin Walk meme, which is used to signify incels. They also have the Chad and Stacy meme. Some incels hate men too. They hate Chads. Chad is a meme where he's kind of seen as an alpha male, he's muscly, and he's the top of the social hierarchy. They are generally conventionally attractive young men, and they've had sexual experience with women. On the other hand, you've also got Stacy. Stacy is another meme, and she's seen as the female counterpart to Chad. She's conventionally attractive, but shallow and a gold digger. As you can imagine, the Chad and Stacy memes are both blonde and blue-eyed and white, as the manosphere does overlap quite a lot with white supremacist and male supremacist ideology. Then you've got the concept of hypergamy. This is where I think a lot of the ideology within the manosphere shows itself to be quite incoherent and quite inconsistent. On one hand, a lot of people within the manosphere believe that women are hypergamous in that they want to marry up, or they will only consider men who are of a higher social standing or a higher financial economic position than they are. And they seem to hate women for this. They seem to blame the fact that they can't get laid on the fact that women are hypergamous. But it's very inconsistent. There's a lot of incoherency, I think, in the manosphere. On one hand, you've got women that are hypergamous, and then on the other hand, you've got they won't have sex with us, so we have blue balls and they are responsible for our mental health issues. And then you've got, on one hand, women don't want to be stay-at-home mums, and then women are gold diggers if they want a man who can provide and support them. Women are making men feel less manly, but then on the other hand, women are not contributing 50%. Incoherent. As I've kind of alluded to there, a lot of men within the manosphere and a lot of men who kind of adopt these beliefs tend to follow similar lines of thinking and thought. So in terms of how the manosphere has shaped their view of women, number one, they tend to view encounters with women as transactional, i.e. I complimented her and I bought her some spaghetti. Why won't she sleep with me? Yep, I'm being for real. Number two, victimhood. I'm a nice guy, hot girls are just bitches and they're hypergamous, so they only want to sleep with someone who's more attractive and more wealthy than I am. Number three, they tend to normalize rape culture and objectification as well as violence against women. Recently in Melbourne, there was a spreadsheet that was like rating women at this one private school, and an Excel spreadsheet spread across Discord, ranging from wifey through to object and unrapeable. And unfortunately, a lot of these men think that they're entitled to sex just because they're men. The thing is that what these men don't realize is that there are a lot of challenges faced by young men today. And instead of blaming these challenges on the structural forces at play, i.e. a patriarchal system, a capitalist system, they tend to blame them instead on women, and in particular feminists. And I'm not gonna lie, young men are facing a lot of challenges nowadays. You know, while we live in a patriarchal society where men dominate the top of our institutions and governments, there's also a large majority of men who identify as NEETs. NEETs stands for not in employment, education, or training. And these are young men from the ages of 18 through to 34 who are underemployed or unemployed and have very little prospects going for them. They tend to be living at home with their parents. In the last couple decades or so, we've seen the changes in the labor market. So traditionally masculine roles have been automated and cast aside in favor of more credentialed roles. So there's been deindustrialization as well as globalization, which has again favored the labor market more towards people who do have credentials and have finished school and have gone to university. Men tend to drop out of school and drop out of university far more than women. And I think this definitely has flow-on effects for men in terms of literacy. I think men, because of the fact that they are on average less educated than women and not finishing high school and dropping out of university, this has a definite flow-on effect in terms of literacy and making young men far more susceptible to conspiratorial and ideological thinking. They don't have the critical thinking and literacy skills required to be able to distinguish truth from ideology. And men are often the victims of manfluences too, i.e. these manfluences such as Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson will capitalize on and exploit their audience any chance they can get for monetary gain. I believe Andrew Tate is selling his online course for $50 a month, allowing his students to escape the matrix. You've also got people spending over $100 to see Jordan Peterson live. But there's a lot of social challenges that men are facing as well. Men have very high and rising rates of mental health problems, including loneliness, depression, and suicide. And I think this kind of feeds into the technological problems that I see as well, that the paradox of social media is that despite how connected we are more lonely than ever before. There's a loneliness epidemic in Australia. And the architecture of social media feeds into this, despite the fact that some people may have a many-to-one connection with a group, i.e. a Reddit community or a Gab community or a YouTube influencer or whatever. They still are lacking that deep one-to-one social connection with someone that could help stave off the harmful effects of loneliness and isolation. As well as that, you've got YouTube algorithms which are deliberately serving content and recommending content that will capture attention, and so it's far more extremist. So the manosphere meets most often on Reddit, 4chan, YouTube, Gab, and other social media. While the influence of the internet in fostering extremism is often overstated, it has had a direct influence on how these groups form and operate. So men in these groups have often weak connections with each other online. So they have a many-to-one relationship in that they feel connected to a broader group, but they are lacking in the deep one-to-one social connection. So these people that frequent manosphere communities or follow influencers within the manosphere, they often remain deeply socially isolated, and they're just generally speaking sitting at home online, growing angrier about their lives with no real one-to-one support. The architecture of social media platforms can push people towards more toxic and extremist discussion. Research by Tiana Gaudet, for example, found that Reddit's voting function normalized radical anti-Muslim and anti-left sentiment in the forum dedicated to support of Donald Trump. Voting was used to mobilize members around these sentiments, creating the sense that participants are part of an in-group as opposed to an identified out-group. Reddit's upvoting feature produced a one-sided narrative that serves to reinforce members' extremist views, wrote Gaudet and her colleagues, thereby strengthening bonds within members of the in-group. Alongside ongoing social isolation, the belief in essential differences between men and women fosters a form of nihilism in which men see no solution for the problems that they are facing. And so with growing extremist content being served to them by algorithms and by the very architecture of the social media platform, this breeds an environment of hatred and misogyny, which then can push some individuals to undertake deadly attacks and acts of violence, or in some cases, terrorism. A lot of incels will reference this online as going ER, which is a way of saying that they are about to undertake an attack. And ex-incels have often said that there is a radicalisation timeline. So it often starts off with consuming content from pickup artists or hustle bro influencers, and that unfortunately leads them down this rabbit hole, especially with algorithmic recommendations towards Andrew Tate types, towards men's rights activists, towards men going their own way, and then eventually black-pilled incels. Even though it's happening online, it has real-world impact. Online misogyny in these spaces directly leads to real-world terrorism. In 2014, for example, Elliot Rodger killed 6 people in a shooting in Isla Vista in California. And in 2018, Alec Minassian drove a rented van through a pedestrian mall in Toronto, killing 10. Each of these men made clear their allegiance to incels. Because of these killings, it has shone a light on misogynist violence, and particularly violence linked to the participation of online forums such as 4chan and Reddit. Donna Zuckerberg, who happens to be the sister of Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, argued in her 2018 book on the issue that social media has elevated misogyny to entirely new levels of violence and virulence. A newly released report from a global team of researchers led by Manuel Horta Ribeiro backs up some of these concerns, finding that online anti-women groups, including incels and men going their own way, i.e. men who believe that relationships with women are so toxic that they are best avoided altogether, appear to be growing. Using data collected from forums like Gab and Reddit, these researchers also found the level of toxicity in the manosphere had risen significantly. Policymakers have also expressed concern about the rising popularity of male supremacist ideology in the way that technology is radicalizing these vulnerable young men. The Director General of the ASIO, Mark Burgess, described how a growing number of extremists no longer fit the left and right political spectrum and are instead motivated by a fear of societal collapse or a specific social or economic grievance or conspiracy. Incels is among the groups that the ASIO are taking more seriously. But yet, Mike Burgess has also ruled that the stabbings in Bondi Junction was not a terrorist attack, in where 1 man and 5 women were killed. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about the ideology of incels and some of the terminology that they use, i.e. being red-pilled or black-pilled or going ER, as well as referencing some of the memes that they use from Chad and Stacey through to even Pepe, unfortunately. Let's talk about some of the solutions to this. Number 1, empathy. Yes, some incels are violent criminals. Okay, but just like some forms of religious extremism, many members of the incel community or the manosphere are vulnerable teenagers. Mental health support, I think, is crucial in this era, especially in like stopping young men from progressing to nihilism and helping stave away some of the fatal feelings of loneliness a lot of young men are feeling. I also think that empathy is a lost art whenever any sort of discussion around these gender wars, as traditional media outlets like to put it. You know, the majority of people unfortunately treat this discussion of gender and gender-based violence, as well as some of the unique challenges faced by all the genders, as a zero-sum game where one party wins and the other one loses. Any sort of progress, any sort of social progress, it's not a zero-sum game. And not only is the gender binary intellectually lazy, I'm just also so sick of the logical fallacies and the whataboutisms that I see from each side of the fence. I think it's about time that we put all these gender wars aside and arrive to some sort of middle ground where we can actually take action. Like, when are we going to be able to find middle ground or an understanding or be actually able to work with one another? Isn't the saying a rising tide lifts all boats? Not only that, but I just find the binary discourse on gender just not only heteronormative, but just restrictive and limiting. I think people, no matter their gender identity, are suffering in this system. And I think we need to start being more solution oriented and actually try and find a productive way to go about this. Because it needs to be collaborative from men, women, and gender diverse people. I think the second solution is calling a spade a spade. The government in Australia is kind of hesitant to acknowledge acts of gender-based violence as a terrorism threat, as most terrorists operate as lone wolves and not part of a broader group. Such is the case of the Bondi Junction attacker recently. Australia is lacking behind other countries such as Canada, which recognise the growing influence of male supremacist ideology in radicalising men, leading to real-world violence. I think another part of the solution is education. I think men need to be educated on how a capitalist patriarchal system affects us all and not just women, and that women aren't to be the blame for the structural challenges that they are facing. I think intersectional feminism applies to men as well, especially the broader swaths of men who aren't employed, aren't educated, still living at home with their parents, who are mentally ill. Another solution that I see is parental supervision online. The rising popularity of Andrew Tate, especially among young boys, has been documented in classrooms around Australia. And I think with unfettered, unsupervised access to the internet, young, impressionable boys are now regurgitating some of the harmful rhetoric spouted by Andrew Tate, whilst hiding behind freedom of speech. I think parents need to do more, need to monitor their kids' internet usage and as well as their video game usage. Because let me tell you something, I've never heard more slurs in my life than in a fucking COD waiting room, bro. Another potential solution, I think, is being able to identify fake news. Extremist ideology relies on the dissemination of misinformation through algorithms and the internet. And I think digital literacy and critical thinking are key skills that can help young men distinguish between what is truth and what is ideology. Another solution that I see to this problem is holding social media platforms to account for the content published by its users. So the US has kind of set a precedent for not treating social media platforms in the same way as publishers. Coupled with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, of 1998, Section 230 provides internet service providers or social media platforms safe harbors to operate as intermediaries of content without fear of being liable for that content, as long as they take reasonable steps to delete or prevent access to that content. Some people love to argue that deplatforming is an attack on freedom of speech, but there's a difference between freedom of speech and hate speech that gives rise to extremism and real-world violence, whether that's an attack in Bondi Junction or the insurrection on July 6th. I also think another part of the solution is how social media algorithms are leading to radicalisation. There's been several examples of algorithmic content on various social media platforms recommending increasingly more extremist and radical content. I've previously spoken and done a podcast episode on how algorithms foster echo chambers and are responsible for driving this increasing polarization that we have. I think a part of the solution to this is making platforms actually publish their algorithms and what drives their algorithms. Another big part of algorithms in terms of content, I think, is the actual design and architecture of social media. Having a dislike button. You notice, particularly on Instagram, without a dislike button, that means whenever you find something that is deliberately trying to incite like rage, or it's just like engagement farming, right? People will share this around and that will amplify these kind of rage baiting content instead of actually minimizing it. The very design of social media is flawed in that by not having a dislike button, it tends to amplify rage bait content instead of dismissing it. These incentives, just drive rage bait content, and you see traditional media outlets trying to capitalize this on all the time. They're dying businesses, they want clicks, therefore they will create articles or headlines that are incendiary enough for you to hate click on it. And I also think that traditional media has a lot to answer for in terms of stoking gender wars, and that where possible, you should be extremely conscious of media outlets that try to incite some sort of hatred for the other. Another solution that I think So the problem is that social media needs to actually enforce age restrictions. The age restriction for social media should be much higher than 12 or 13 or whatever it is now. I think it should be 16 at the very least. Thanks to inquiries by Congress in the United States and work done in the European Union, I think social media platforms are finally having their big tobacco moment. Legislators and parents alike are waking up to the harmful effects of social media, especially on teenagers in their formative years, which is literally leading to an epidemic of mental health problems in young adults and teenagers. These are just some of the solutions that I see, but I'd be very curious to hear whether you have any solutions that you see that can help with this national crisis that we are facing. That's all from me this week. I'll see you in my next episode next week. Stay safe. Again, if this podcast episode brings up any sort of heavy emotions that you're struggling to navigate or deal with, I highly implore you and encourage you to contact 1-800-RESPECT. It's a 24/7 hotline, or you can also contact WIRE at 1300 134 130. So that's all from me. Hopefully will be a much more lighter topic next week. Bye.